was growing up in Fresno, California, my parents were interested in Japanese culture, also other Asian cultures. My mother studied Chinese history. She did her MA in Chinese history. My father was very interested in Japanese garden. He built a Japanese garden, self-designed a garden, built a tea house, and so on. So I grew up in this environment. And then at some point when my mother was studying Chinese, I wanted to learn Chinese characters. And I was 14 years old when I decided that I wanted to do that. And but we couldn't find a place for people my age, to study Chinese. But then there was the Saturday morning Japanese classes at the Buddhist temple, which had been built by the Japanese American community in 1910. So I went there. I studied Japanese. What I experienced when I first came to Japan in my 20s was that for the first time in my life, I was never lonely. There were lots of people who I shared interests with, the other foreigners I met, had some Japan for whatever purpose or whatever, because they liked Japan or pursuing a particular type of career or what have you. So, and then the Japanese too, where the Japanese always wanted to talk to you or go out with you or have you drinks with you and so on. So I was never lonely. And it seems like whenever, when I'm in the States, it's a little bit different now as an older person, it's a different situation and a different era. But yeah, there was that, I think. Well, I think some of the, I was exposed to poetry when I was in high school, and the local poet in Fresno was Philip Levine, and he came and read our classes in high school, that sort of thing, and I was interested in. I was one of those kids that did all the various creative things. I was a good writer, but did well in writing classes, and as well as being a musician in the orchestra, and did some photography, and so on. I was interested, from that time. I think it was in college probably when I decided that I really wanted to be a poet. I had a class from the workshop from Michael Palmer, who was one of my early influences. But he presented, we had an anthology, the New American Poetry. It was published in the 50s. That was, the new poetry of that time, including poets like Robert Creeley and so on, Robert Duncan, and so on, Levertov, and various other poets of that sort. And I was also introduced to modern jazz and abstract expressionist painting at the same time. So this all came as a set for me. And so abstract expressionist painting became very important to me too, and not just as something that I liked separate from poetry, part of poetry. The whole thinking and approach to abstract expressionist painting was something that was influenced by my poetry as well. One of the most important statements, artist statements to my poetry at the time, to my development as a poet, was Jackson Pollock's famous words about, it begins when I am in my painting. What was important to him that he put the painting on the floor and he was over it and, doing the swirls. It was almost, he was inside the painting, and it was all about process, not what kind of product do you produce, but there's a whole process and relationship with the work and with, what he was doing and so on. And that was really important to my thinking on poetry. It took me a long time to really develop my own kind of poetic form and poetic language and so on. But that was really the beginnings of the kind of thinking I had. But then, Japanese poetry and translation came to me also at the same time. Translation from the very beginning was already part of poetry for me, not just because I was interested in translating Japanese poems, but because poetry itself is already translation. The poetic process itself has a kind of translation process. I think I'm less certain about that now than I used to be. In a way, it's never finished, but in terms of, this page, this portion, or this work is finished, it's a very musical sensibility. It's just ended on, that's the right note. That's the particular note, particular rhythm where I want it to end. So it's really very much a musical sensibility. I became more attracted to both the calligraphy, also painting, abstract painting in acrylics, is that it's a very physical sensation. There was a physical need to do the painting. I just needed to press into the paper, and there's a relationship with the papers too. There's a lot of the materials, the papers and the paints and brushes and so on. So it's a very sensual kind of relationship. So the question of what is I do abstract calligraphy. Almost a lot of them look like characters. Most Japanese people will say, "Oh, isn't that character? I think it's this." No, they'll come up with something. And then a lot of people commenting on when I upload something, there have been fewer people doing this lately, but some people insist that it acts as a Rorschach test, and they'll look at them and they think they see something, some animal jumping or whatever, and they'll say, "Oh, it's this," which of course it's not, because it's abstract. It's not an object or a shape out there in the world. It looks a little bit like a Chinese character, but and even if you aren't doing calligraphy, you learn kanji, and you have to learn the correct stroke order and how to make certain kinds of strokes. You don't do it just any old way, it has to look the right way and have the right shapes and so on. So even with a pen, you have to do that. So I had all that training in my background, writing kanji, and then being trained into the basics of calligraphy. So it seemed quite natural to pick up the brush and do that. And even when I'm doing abstract shapes, a lot of them look like kanji or have strokes that are made in the way that you make those strokes in calligraphy. That's why you get into the paper and lift up. And I always liked these. My handwriting in English is horrible, and no one always remarks on that. But one of the interesting characteristics of my bad handwriting is that it has strokes that are like kanji strokes. You have this trailing edge or this hook that goes off, like this. That's yeah. There was one of part of my studies in Japanese culture during my year in Japan, 75, 76. I also studied art and so on. my favorite period in the arts was the Azuchi Momoyama period. This was just before Calcutta period. It's the beginning of the medieval period. That's the period of time when so many of these Japanese arts really developed. All this stuff originally comes from China via Korea, and then gradually they were developed in much more highly developed art, whether it's gardens, rock gardens, the tea ceremony, and so on, or what have you. And there were also the brush painting. Yeah, too, is I like a lot. Painter Sesshu, for instance, who I really liked. Again, it's all about the white space, the blank area, the mountain. Huge mountain is like this one stroke, couple dots of the humans, and then the rest is just this white space. The hugeness of the mountain is created by virtue of the empty space below it. And I always loved that approach. That's what sense. And so there were a lot of Zen priests at that time were involved in various arts, and it's the famous, the eccentric Zen priest. The one thing in the Middle Ages, the Rinzai school of the Sudden Enlightenment school of Zen became a very major, partly because they accepted people as lay practitioners, such as warriors. You could still be a warrior and practice swordsmanship and also practice Zen. So swordsmanship became a kind of Zen. So basically, anything you do could be a Zen of some kind. It had to do with, having emptying your mind and becoming one with the objects and who you use, whether it's a sword or a brush or what have you. And so a lot of these eccentric priests, when they did calligraphy, they just go and basically do these very abstract-looking shapes that often are impossible to read. They are characters. In this case, they actually are writing something. It might be a Zen saying of some sort. They're write out a haiku or something of that sort. Although there was not haiku yet in that period, until the Edo period. But maybe a waka or a Chinese poem in Chinese, kanshi. And I always loved that kind of calligraphy too. My favorite type of calligraphy were period of calligraphy by Zen, Zen priests and so on. And that was always there in my background, that this kind of thing, the interest in traditional arts kind of fell by the wayside for a while I was pursuing poetry, and also the kind of the types of arts and literature in Japan that I was interested in and spent a lot of time with as a translator or studying. Was more avant-garde art. It was the Butoh dance, and avant-garde poets that translated and so on. So I wasn't doing the traditional thing, and there was also the growing awareness of stereotypical stuff. The Japanophile falls in love with this traditional thing. You have to go to Kyoto. You have to. And so I sort of rejected all that sort of thing for a while, but then found myself coming back to those roots as an older person. Came back to Japan, and I was in my mid-50s when I came back to Japan, and took another trip to Kyoto and to temple in Toyama, where I'd spent time. I did the more of a touristy thing, but I spent a night at Eiheiji, doing zazen in the morning. Those sorts of things gradually, came back to me, and I think same thing the calligraphy, sort of integrating it into what I do and in writing, and in the notebook becomes a kind of artwork. It's notebook art, if you will. There's writing, a lot of quotations on my own writing, diary entries, my own poems, and so on, and calligraphy. It's most, I mean, the ideal, I mean, the biggest is to have the characters come in and start to invade the language in a way, or have something with, I mean, that's kind of almost like an abstract expressionist work there. And I had been fooling around with lines. I felt I'd become kind of, almost inarticulate in poetry. It's like I wanted to write poetry, but I couldn't really come up with, say, a word, short phrase, or whatever. And so it's become quite a bit different than my older work, which is more lengthy, prose poems and so on. I wouldn't, claim that I'm doing any kind of Zen practice, properly speaking, but yeah, there is a Zen aspect to doing the calligraphy in the sense that you have to empty the mind and go with the, feeling out the character, and not if you think too much about it, then it ruins it. If you lack focus, if you have no focus, that ruins it too. You have to be least focused, since it's focused on the page and holding the brush. So it's a kind of controlled spontaneity, shall we say. And I've done some more gone back and reread some things in Zen too, and there's kind of a return of that aspect of my background also. I was first introduced to Zen when I was in junior high, so my mother handed me that book, The Way of Zen by Alan Watts. So that's what I read when I was like 14 years old. And so then I was into Zen up to that point, and did a lot of reading and tried meditating. I made some visits to the Zen Center in San Francisco when I was a student. So yes, I have that in my background. I wouldn't say that I'm consciously, or think this as Zen practice in the proper sense of the term, but I have more and more in my poetry in general become more concerned and more aware of, especially keeping the notebook as a practice. It's all a practice of sorts. And there are a number of poets I'm connected with in California. One of them is a Zen priest himself, and there is a Zen relationship. But people, again, also who approach poetry as a practice, sort of as daily writing that's done, and certain approach taken to it, and so on, which is something. The interest in process and practice is as opposed to the concern with the product. The finished poem is going to look in a certain way, and that's going to be the kind that the editors to poetry magazine like, and they'll publish and so on. You can package it. It can be packaged and sold as a product. Not that poetry sells well at all, of course, these days. But one of the things that the language poets tried to work against in the type of work that they produced and in their theories and so on, was to work against that idea of poetry as a product, something that you package. So one of the ways to do it was to write poetry in a way that was completely different from conventional poetry, with its confessional poetry, with having the idea is that the poet is this consciousness, this ego, and writes about their feelings or views or confesses something, whatever. There's always a sense of there's the poet there, has this particular voice and is saying this thing. So out was the poet, out with the personality of the poet, the ego of the poet.